The gunshot rang out across the dusty street of Central City, Colorado, shattering the early evening calm and sending Jessica Ainsworth diving for cover behind a water trough. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she pressed her back against the rough wood, the wanted poster with her face on it crumpled in her trembling hand. $5,000 for the capture of Jessica Ainsworth, dead or alive for a murder she never committed. There she is. A gruff voice shouted, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the dirt road. It was 1876, and the West was still wild enough that a woman could be hunted like an animal based on nothing more than circumstantial evidence and a vengeful accusation. Jessica had been on the run for 3 weeks since fleeing Pueblo after being falsely accused of killing Harold Wingate, a wealthy businessman who had made unwanted advances toward her. She'd refused him, and somehow ended up framed for his murder the very next day. Jessica appeared around the edge of the trough. 3 men with rifles were advancing down the street, their faces set with grim determination beneath the brim of their hats. Bounty hunters. They'd tracked her from Pueblo all the way to Central City, and now they had her cornered. The sound of spurs jingling made her turn. A tall man stood beside his horse, watching her with sharp blue eyes beneath the shadow of his Stetson. His weathered face revealed nothing as he looked from her to the approaching bounty hunters. "Please," Jessica whispered, knowing how desperate she must look with her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her once fine dress covered in trail dust. "They're going to kill me for something I didn't do." The stranger studied her for a long moment. "Name's Matthew Graham," he said finally, his voice low and rough like he didn't use it much. "Get on my horse." Jessica hesitated only a second before taking his outstretched hand. He hoisted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness for hands so calloused. "Hold tight," Matthew instructed, swinging up behind her. He kicked his heels into the horse's flanks and they took off in a cloud of dust just as another bullet whizzed past. "After them," one of the bounty hunters shouted. Matthew guided the horse expertly through the back alleys of Central City, the powerful animal responding to the slightest pressure of his knees. Jessica clung to the saddle horn, aware of the solid warmth of the cowboy at her back, the only thing between her and certain death. "Why are you helping me?" she asked over the pounding of hooves. "Don't much like seeing 3 men hunting a woman," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Especially when she looks more scared than dangerous." They burst out of town, heading toward the rugged mountains that loomed over Central City. Behind them, Jessica could hear the bounty hunters mounting up and giving chase. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. "They're still coming," she said, panic rising in her throat. Matthew nodded. "Good." The trail grew steeper as they entered the foothills, winding between pines and aspens turning gold with the early autumn. Matthew kept the horse at a steady pace, never pushing too hard but never slowing enough to let their pursuers gain ground. "You know these mountains?" Jessica asked. "Every rock and tree," Matthew answered. "Worked as a guide before I started ranching. Trust me, Miss Ainsworth." Jessica Ainsworth. "Trust me, Miss Ainsworth. I know what I'm doing." As the light faded, they entered a narrow pass between towering rock walls. The path twisted and turned, forcing them to slow. Jessica could hear the bounty hunters' horses somewhere behind them, the sound echoing off the stone. "We're trapped," she whispered as the canyon walls rose higher on either side. Matthew's arm tightened briefly around her waist. "Not trapped. Just wait." The canyon narrowed further until the path was barely wide enough for the horse. Jessica could touch the rock walls on either side if she stretched out her hands. Then suddenly, the canyon opened into a small box with sheer walls on 3 sides, a dead end. "What now?" Jessica asked, fear making her voice sharp. Matthew dismounted and helped her down. "Now we wait." He led the horse to one side and tied it to a scrubby juniper growing from a crack in the wall. Then he lifted his rifle from its scabbard. "But they'll ride straight into a trap," Matthew said, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. He pointed up to the narrow entrance they'd just passed through. "That's the only way in or out, and they'll have to come through one at a time. Plus," he gestured upward. Jessica followed his gaze and gasped. The rims of the canyon were lined with men, at least a dozen, all with rifles pointed down toward the entrance. "My ranch hands," Matthew explained. "I whistled for them when we first hit the trail. They know these mountains as well as I do." Before Jessica could respond, the first bounty hunter appeared at the canyon mouth. He pulled up short when he saw them waiting, but it was too late. The other hunters bunched up behind him, trapped in the narrow passage. "That's far enough," Matthew called out, his rifle aimed steady. "Drop your weapons." The leader of the bounty hunters, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, snarled, "This ain't your business, Graham. The woman's wanted for murder, $5,000 on her head." "I didn't kill anyone," Jessica called out, finding her voice despite her fear. "Harold Wingate was already dead when I found him." "Save it for the judge," another hunter called. "We're taking you in." Matthew's voice remained calm. "Look up, gentlemen." The bounty hunters glanced upward, their faces falling as they registered the rifles aimed at them from the rim. "Now," Matthew continued, "you have two choices. Drop your weapons and leave, or start shooting and see how that works out for you." For a tense moment, Jessica thought the hunters would choose to fight. Then the leader slowly lowered his rifle. "This isn't over," he growled. "That bounty's still good, and we mean to collect." "Not today you won't," Matthew replied. One by one, the bounty hunters backed their horses out of the narrow entrance, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Matthew kept his rifle trained on them until the last one was gone. Then he signaled to his men on the rim. They began to make their way down the steep canyon walls. Jessica's knees suddenly felt weak. She sank down onto a boulder, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she said, looking up at the cowboy who just saved her life. "But why? You don't know me. You don't know if I'm guilty or innocent." Matthew leaned his rifle against the canyon wall and crouched down to her level, his blue eyes serious in his sun-weathered face. "I know scared, and I know desperate, and I know honest when I see it." He paused. "Besides, I've had my own run-ins with those particular bounty hunters. They care more about the money than justice." Jessica looked away. "I didn't kill Harold Wingate. He made advances toward me. I worked as a seamstress in his wife's dress shop. When I refused him, he threatened to ruin me. The next morning he was found dead, and somehow all evidence pointed to me." "Who would want him dead?" "Half of Pueblo," Jessica said with a bitter laugh. "He had enemies everywhere. Business rivals, gambling debts, scorned women. But I was the easiest to blame, just a seamstress with no family to defend me." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Ainsworth, you're safe for now. My ranch is on the other side of these mountains. You can stay there while we figure out what to do next." By now, his ranch hands had reached the canyon floor, a collection of weathered men with curious eyes. Matthew introduced them one by one, and Jessica tried to remember their names, though her mind was still reeling from the day's events. They camped in the box canyon that night, building a small fire that cast flickering shadows against the stone walls. Matthew's men shared their provisions: jerky, hardtack, and coffee that tasted better than the finest restaurant meal to Jessica after weeks on the run. As the men settled in for the night, Jessica found herself sitting beside Matthew at the edge of the firelight. Above them, the Colorado sky was a vast expanse of stars, brighter than she'd ever seen them. "Those bounty hunters will be back," she said quietly. Matthew nodded. Most likely. But they'll be more careful next time. I've put you in danger, you and your men. We can handle ourselves. He poured her another cup of coffee from the pot at the edge of the fire. Tell me about yourself, Miss Ainsworth, before all this trouble. Jessica wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup. There's not much to tell. My parents died when I was 16. Influenza. I've been on my own since then, working as a seamstress. I came west from Philadelphia 3 years ago, looking for a fresh start. She gave a small, ironic laugh. Found more than I bargained for. The West has a way of testing people, Matthew agreed, finding out what they're made of. And what about you, Mr. Graham? Have you always been a rancher? Matthew gazed into the fire. No, was a soldier first, fought in the war. Then did some scouting for the army, guiding settlers. Saved enough to buy my ranch 5 years ago. He looked at her, the firelight casting his face half in shadow. It's a good life, peaceful mostly. Until you decided to rescue strange women from bounty hunters, Jessica said with a small smile. The corner of Matthew's mouth lifted slightly. Makes for a change of pace. They fell silent, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional snort of the horses. Despite everything, Jessica felt safer than she had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, she knew, but for tonight she could breathe. Try to get some sleep, Matthew said eventually, offering her his bedroll. We'll head to the ranch at first light. Jessica accepted the blanket gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Graham, for everything. Matthew, he corrected. And you're welcome, Jessica. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, painting the canyon walls with golden light. Matthew's men were already up, drinking coffee and breaking camp with the efficiency of men used to life on the trail. Jessica had slept better than expected, wrapped in Matthew's bedroll that carried the scent of pine and leather. Ready to ride? Matthew asked, appearing beside her with a tin cup of coffee. Jessica nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. She'd worn the same dress for days now, and she was painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. Still, vanity seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford at the moment. We'll take a different route back, Matthew explained. Less direct, but safer. If those bounty hunters are smart, they'll be watching the main trails. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, riding in single file along a narrow path that seemed to cling to the mountainside. Jessica rode behind Matthew, on a gentle mare one of his hands had brought. The view was breathtaking, forests of pine and aspen stretching across valleys, rugged peaks still capped with snow despite the late summer season. It's beautiful, Jessica murmured when they paused to rest the horses at midday. I've never seen mountains like these. They grow on you, Matthew said, handing her some jerky and hardtack. First winter I spent out here, I thought I'd made a mistake. But then spring came and I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Your ranch. Is it large? Large enough. Good grazing land, plenty of water. The house isn't much, just a cabin I built myself. Been adding to it bit by bit. They continued their journey through the afternoon, descending gradually toward more hospitable terrain. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Matthew pulled his horse to a halt. There it is, he said, pointing to the valley below. Jessica followed his gesture and saw a collection of buildings nestled beside a creek that wound through a broad meadow. Cattle dotted the grasslands, and horses grazed in a fenced pasture near the main house, a substantial log structure with a wide porch. It's lovely, she said sincerely. Matthew's expression softened with pride. It's home. They rode down into the valley as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow. As they approached the ranch, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's Mrs. Hoffman," Matthew explained. "She keeps house for me, makes sure I don't live like a complete savage." Mrs. Hoffman was a sturdy woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw Matthew. "About time you got back," she called. "Was beginning to worry." Her eyes widened when she spotted Jessica. "And you've brought company." Matthew dismounted and helped Jessica down from her horse. "Mrs. Hoffman, this is Miss Jessica Ainsworth. She'll be staying with us for a while. Miss Ainsworth, Mrs. Hoffman." The housekeeper gave Jessica an appraising look, taking in her travel-worn appearance without comment. "Well, you look like you could use a hot meal and a bath, Miss Ainsworth. Come along inside." Jessica nearly wept at the mention of a bath. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Hoffman led her into the house while Matthew remained outside with his men, giving orders about watching the trails and posting guards. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, rustic, but clean, with sturdy furniture and colorful woven rugs on the plank floors. "Mr. Graham said you're in some kind of trouble," Mrs. Hoffman said as she showed Jessica to a bedroom. "Don't worry about explaining it to me now. Let's get you cleaned up first." Within an hour, Jessica was soaking in a copper tub filled with hot water, the first proper bath she'd had since fleeing Pueblo. Mrs. Hoffman had provided clean clothes, simple but well-made dresses that she said belonged to her daughter who was away teaching school in Denver. "They might be a bit loose on you," the housekeeper commented. "You're a slender thing." By the time Jessica emerged from the bedroom, feeling human again in a fresh blue calico dress, the ranch hands had come in from their chores and were gathering around the long table in the dining room. Matthew stood when she entered and the other men quickly followed suit. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her transformation. "I hope you're feeling better." "Much, thank you." Jessica found herself blushing under his gaze. Dinner was a hearty affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and vegetables from Mrs. Hoffman's garden. The men were polite but curious, stealing glances at Jessica throughout the meal. Eventually, Matthew cleared his throat. "Miss Ainsworth is in a difficult situation," he explained to the table at large. "She's been falsely accused of a crime back in Pueblo, and there are bounty hunters after her. That's why we'll be doubling our watches and keeping our eyes open." One of the ranch hands, a weather-beaten man named Tom, spoke up. "Begging your pardon, miss, but what are you accused of?" Jessica set down her spoon, suddenly aware of all eyes on her. "Murder," she said quietly. "They say I killed Harold Wingate, a businessman in Pueblo, but I didn't." "Harold Wingate?" One of the younger cowboys, Billy, leaned forward. "I heard about that. Rich fellow found stabbed in his office." Jessica nodded. "Yes, I worked for his wife as a seamstress. I had refused his inappropriate advances the day before. When he was found dead, it was easy to point the finger at me." "But you had no motive," Matthew said. "Refusing a man's advances isn't reason to kill him." "They claimed I was his secret lover, that we had quarreled," Jessica explained, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. "It wasn't true, but once the rumor started, well, it was my word against that of Pueblo's most prominent citizens. His wife was quick to support the story. I think she was relieved to have someone to blame besides herself." "You think she did it?" Matthew asked sharply. Jessica shook her head. "I don't know, maybe, or maybe one of his business partners. All I know is that I didn't, but no one would believe me, so I ran." Silence fell over the table. Then Tom nodded firmly. "Well, you're safe here, Miss Ainsworth. Anyone comes looking for you, they'll have to go through us first." Murmurs of agreement rose from around the table, and Jessica felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you." After dinner, while Mrs. Hoffman and some of the men cleared the table, Matthew invited Jessica to join him on the porch. The night was cool but not cold, the sky once again a canopy of stars above the dark silhouettes of the mountains. "Your men are very loyal," Jessica observed as they sat in rocking chairs side by side. "Good men," Matthew agreed. "Most have been with me since I started the ranch. We've been through some hard times together." "And they'll risk themselves for a stranger on your word." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Out here we have to look out for each other. Law's too far away most times. We make our own justice." "Is that what this is, justice? Isn't it?" He looked at her, his expression serious in the lantern light. "You didn't kill that man, did you?" "No," Jessica met his gaze directly. "I didn't." "Then helping you is the right thing to do." He paused. "But we need to think about what comes next. Those bounty hunters won't give up easily, not with $5,000 at stake." "I could leave," Jessica offered reluctantly. "Keep heading west, maybe to California." Matthew shook his head. "Running forever isn't a life. Besides, if you're innocent, there must be a way to prove it." "How? I have no evidence." "We start by learning more about Wingate's murder. Who stood to gain from his death? Who had opportunity?" He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I have a friend in Pueblo, a lawman I trust. I could write to him, ask him to look into things quietly." Hope, small and fragile, flickered to life in Jessica's chest. "You would do that?" "I would." He met her eyes again. "In the meantime, you'll stay here, you'll be safe." Jessica looked out at the peaceful valley, silver in the moonlight. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Matthew said simply. "Get some rest. Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Jessica found herself thinking about Matthew Graham. He was unlike any man she'd ever met, quiet but resolute, kind without weakness. His eyes held shadows that spoke of hard experiences, yet there was a gentleness in how he treated those in his care. It was dangerous, she knew, to let herself feel anything for him. Her life was in chaos, her future uncertain. And yet, as she drifted toward sleep, it was his face she saw, weather-tanned and serious, with those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. The following days established a rhythm to life on the Graham ranch. Jessica, unwilling to be idle, asked Mrs. Hoffman how she could help. Soon she was assisting with cooking, mending the cowboy's clothes, and even helping in the vegetable garden. The work was therapeutic, keeping her hands busy while her mind processed everything that had happened. Matthew was often out with his men, tending to cattle or riding the boundaries of his property. But he made time each evening to sit with her on the porch, discussing the day or sometimes just sitting in companionable silence as the stars appeared. A week after her arrival, Matthew returned from a trip to Central City with supplies and a letter. "It's from my friend in Pueblo," he explained as they sat in his study after dinner. "Sheriff Daniels. He's been asking questions about Wingate's death." Jessica leaned forward anxiously. "What did he find out?" Matthew unfolded the letter. "Quite a bit, actually. Wingate was in financial trouble, despite appearances. He'd made some bad investments, borrowed heavily. His widow inherited everything, but she was apparently unaware of their precarious financial situation." "That gives her a motive," Jessica observed. "If she found out, she might have killed him in anger, or to protect her inheritance before his creditors came calling." "There's more," Matthew continued. "Wingate had a business partner, James Hollister. According to Daniels, Hollister had been embezzling from their company for months. Wingate had just discovered it the day before he died." Jessica gasped. "So Hollister had an even stronger motive. If Wingate exposed him, he'd go to prison." "Exactly. Daniels is looking into both of them, but discreetly. He doesn't want to tip them off." Matthew folded the letter. "It's a start, Jessica. Not enough to clear your name yet, but it gives us something to work with." Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since she'd fled Pueblo, there seemed to be a path forward that didn't involve running forever. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for helping me." Matthew's gaze lingered on her face. "You're easy to believe." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken things. Then Mrs. Hoffman knocked on the study door, breaking the spell. Mr. Graham, Ryder, coming in. One of the boys spotted him from the North Ridge. Matthew was immediately alert. "One of ours. Don't think so, sir." "Stay here," he told Jessica, rising quickly. "Mrs. Hoffman, make sure Miss Ainsworth remains inside." Jessica followed Mrs. Hoffman to the kitchen, her heart racing. Through the window, she could see Matthew striding toward the barn where several of his ranch hands were already gathering, rifles in hand. "Don't worry yourself," Mrs. Hoffman said, seeing her anxious expression. "Mr. Graham knows how to handle trouble." "I've brought enough of it to his doorstep," Jessica murmured. "Nonsense. That man's been alone too long. A little excitement might do him good." There was a knowing glint in the housekeeper's eye that made Jessica blush. "It's not like that," she protested. "Mrs. Hoffman just hummed noncommittally and continued kneading bread dough. From the kitchen window, Jessica could see Matthew meeting a lone rider at the edge of the ranch yard. The stranger dismounted, and they appeared to converse for several minutes. There was no sign of hostility, though Matthew's men remained vigilantly positioned around the property. Finally, Matthew shook the rider's hand, and the man remounted and rode away. Matthew turned back toward the house, his expression thoughtful. "What was that about?" Jessica asked when he entered the kitchen. "Message from town," Matthew explained. "Those bounty hunters have been asking questions all over Central City and the surrounding areas, offering rewards for information about you." Jessica's stomach clenched with fear. "Do they know I'm here?" "No, but they're getting closer. They're thorough, I'll give them that." Matthew turned to Mrs. Hoffman. "Martha, would you give us a moment?" The housekeeper nodded and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "We need to be more careful," Matthew said once they were alone. "No more trips into town for any of us, and you should stay close to the house." "Maybe I should leave," Jessica suggested, though the thought made her heart ache. "I don't want to put you and your men in danger." Matthew stepped closer, his eyes intent. "You're not going anywhere, not alone. We started this together and we'll finish it together. But if they find me here, then we'll deal with it." His voice softened. "Jessica, I made you a promise. I intend to keep it." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Why, you barely know me." Matthew hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his face before he masked it. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do, to have no one believe in you." Jessica sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she simply nodded. "All right, I'll stay." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Good. Now let's talk about something more pleasant. How would you like to learn to ride properly? Might come in handy." Jessica smiled despite her worry. "I'd like that very much." The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a riding lesson. Matthew selected a gentle mare named Daisy for Jessica, and they spent the early hours in the corral near the barn. Jessica had ridden before, but only side saddle in the city parks of Philadelphia. Matthew taught her to ride astride, the way women in the West often did when practicality trumped Eastern notions of propriety. "You're a natural," he observed as she guided Daisy in a circle around the corral. Jessica laughed, feeling freer than she had in weeks. "I think Daisy deserves most of the credit. She's very patient with me. She knows a good person when she meets one." Matthew leaned against the fence, watching her with a small smile. "Want to try a short trail ride? There's a pretty spot by the creek I'd like to show you." They rode out together, following a path that wound through aspen groves shimmering with golden leaves. Jessica was growing more confident in the saddle, though she still clutched the reins a bit too tightly. "Relax your hands," Matthew advised, riding beside her. "Daisy can feel every tension in your body. The more you relax, the more she will." Jessica consciously loosened her grip. "Like this. Better." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "You're doing well, Jessica. Most city folks take weeks to get this comfortable on horseback." "I had a good teacher," she replied, smiling back at him. They reached a bend in the creek where the water formed a small, clear pool before continuing its journey down the valley. Wildflowers still bloomed along the banks despite the advancing autumn, and a pair of massive cottonwood trees provided shade. Matthew dismounted and helped Jessica down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. They let the horses drink from the creek, then secured them to a low branch where they could graze on the lush grass. "This is beautiful," Jessica said, looking around at the peaceful scene. "Do you come here often, when I need thinking space?" Matthew spread his coat on the ground beneath one of the cottonwoods, gesturing for her to sit. "It's quiet, good for clearing the head." They sat side by side, listening to the gentle sound of the creek and the occasional call of a meadowlark. Matthew pulled out a small package wrapped in waxed paper from his saddlebag. "Mrs. Hoffman sent along some of her molasses cookies," he explained, offering them to Jessica. She accepted one gratefully. "She's been so kind to me, all of you have. It's easy to be kind to you." Matthew's voice was soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Jessica looked at him, suddenly aware of how his shoulder brushed against hers, how the dappled sunlight through the leaves cast shifting patterns across his strong features. In that moment, she realized with startling clarity that she was falling in love with this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything to help a stranger. The thought terrified her. Her life was still in chaos, her future uncertain. She had nothing to offer him but complications and danger. And yet, she couldn't deny the way her heart quickened when he was near, or how she looked forward to their evening conversations on the porch more than anything else in her day. Matthew met her gaze, and something in his expression shifted, softened. He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Jessica," he said quietly. The sharp crack of a rifle shot cut through the peaceful afternoon, sending birds scattering from the trees. Matthew reacted instantly, pulling Jessica to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot splintered bark from the cottonwood just above their heads. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Crawl to the horses. Stay low." Jessica's heart hammered in her chest as she began inching toward where Daisy and Matthew's gelding stood nervously tugging at their reins. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the ground just feet away, spraying dirt and pebbles. "Ain't no use running, Miss Ainsworth." A voice called out the bounty hunter with the scarred face. "We got you surrounded this time. No box canyon to hide in." Matthew's jaw tightened. "There are at least 3 of them," he whispered. "When I start shooting, get on your horse and ride hard back to the ranch. My men will hear the shots." "I'm not leaving you," Jessica protested. "Yes, you are." His eyes were fierce. "This is what they want, both of us out in the open. Now go when I tell you." Before she could argue further, Matthew rose to one knee and fired 3 rapid shots toward a rocky outcropping where one of the bounty hunters was concealed. The man yelped in pain. "Now!" Matthew shouted, continuing to provide covering fire as Jessica scrambled to her feet and untied Daisy's reins. She had just put her foot in the stirrup when she saw movement in the trees to their right, another bounty hunter taking aim at Matthew's exposed back. "Matthew, behind you," she cried. He whirled, firing just as the hunter did. Both men went down the hunter with a bullet in his shoulder, Matthew clutching his side where blood was beginning to seep through his shirt. "Matthew." Jessica abandoned her escape and rushed to his side. "I'm all right," he grunted, though his face had gone pale. "Just grazed me. You need to go." "Come out with your hands up," the lead bounty hunter called, "or the next one goes through your head." Jessica helped Matthew to his feet, supporting him with her shoulder. Blood was staining his shirt, but he remained standing, his revolver steady in his hand. "You want her, Farley, you'll have to go through me," Matthew called back. "That can be arranged," the hunter Farley replied. $5,000 is plenty to compensate for the trouble." Jessica felt Matthew tense beside her, preparing for whatever came next. Then, from the direction of the ranch, came the thunder of approaching hooves. Tom and 3 other ranch hands burst into view, rifles raised. "Boss," Tom called. "You all right?" Farley cursed loudly. Once again outnumbered, the bounty hunters began retreating, firing a few parting shots before disappearing into the trees. "They're running," Billy shouted, preparing to give chase. "Let them go," Matthew ordered, his voice strained. "Get back to the ranch. They might circle around." Tom dismounted quickly, his face concerned as he took in Matthew's bloody shirt. "You're hit. It's not deep. Help me onto my horse." The ride back to the ranch was tense, with the men forming a protective circle around Matthew and Jessica. Matthew refused to show any sign of weakness, though Jessica could tell from the rigid set of his jaw that he was in considerable pain. At the ranch, Mrs. Hoffman took charge, ordering Matthew to the kitchen where she could tend his wound. It was indeed just a graze, though a deep one that required cleaning and bandaging. "You're lucky," Mrs. Hoffman scolded as she worked. "Another inch and we'd be digging a bullet out of you." Matthew winced as she applied iodine to the wound. "Luck had nothing to do with it. If Jessica hadn't warned me, I'd be dead." Jessica stood nearby, hands trembling as the events of the afternoon caught up with her. "This is my fault," she said, her voice barely audible. "All of this." Matthew reached out and caught her hand. "No. This is the fault of men who care more about money than truth." His grip tightened. "But they've made a mistake coming onto my land and shooting at me and mine. That changes things." "What do you mean?" Jessica asked. "I mean we're done waiting for news from Pueblo. Tomorrow I'm riding there myself." "Matthew, no, you're injured. And those men are still out there." "Which is why you're coming with me," he replied. "It's not safe for you here anymore now that they know where to find you. We need to end this, Jessica. Find the real killer and clear your name." "But how?" "I have an idea. But first, we all need rest. We'll leave before dawn." That night, despite Mrs. Hoffman's insistence that he stay in bed, Matthew called a meeting of all his ranch hands in the main room of the house. He stood before them, his side bandaged but his voice strong. "Those bounty hunters crossed a line today," he told them. "They came onto our land and opened fire without warning. Next time, they might not run so easily." He looked around at the faces of his men. "I'm taking Miss Ainsworth to Pueblo tomorrow to resolve this matter once and for all. While I'm gone, Tom will be in charge." "Boss, you sure that's wise?" Tom asked. "Going right into the lion's den." "Sometimes the only way out is through," Matthew replied. "I need most of you here protecting the ranch, but I'll take Billy and Joe with us as far as Pueblo." The men nodded, accepting his decision. Jessica watched them, moved by their loyalty to Matthew and their willingness to protect her, a woman they barely knew. Later, when the house had quieted, Jessica found Matthew on the porch, staring out at the night. His profile was stern in the moonlight, his shoulders tense. "You should be resting," she said softly, joining him at the railing. "Too much on my mind for sleep." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "The same." She hesitated. "Matthew, I can't ask you to risk your life like this. You've already been shot because of me. You're not asking, I'm offering. He turned to face her fully. Jessica, when I found you in Central City, I made a choice. I'm seeing it through. But why? And don't tell me it's just because it's the right thing to do. There's more. Matthew was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. After the war, I worked as a scout for the army. There was an incident, a raid on a Cheyenne camp that wasn't supposed to happen. Women and children died. I refused to lead any more expeditions after that, spoke out against what had happened. His jaw tightened. The army didn't take kindly to criticism. They court-martialed me, claimed I had disobeyed orders before the raid, that the deaths were my fault. Jessica's breath caught. That's why you said you understand what it's like to be falsely accused. He nodded. I was cleared. Eventually another scout came forward with the truth, but by then the damage was done. My reputation, my career. He shook his head. I came out here to start over, to find peace. His eyes found hers in the darkness. When I saw you in Central City, something in your face reminded me of how I felt back then, cornered, desperate, alone. You're not alone anymore, Jessica said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. Matthew covered her hand with his own. Neither are you. In the quiet that followed, Jessica felt the last of her defenses crumbling. This man had saved her, believed in her, and now was willing to risk everything to help her find justice. What had begun as gratitude had grown into something much deeper, much more powerful. Matthew stepped closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Jessica, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I know the timing is all wrong. I know we've only known each other a short while. But she stopped his words by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. For a moment he seemed surprised, then his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he returned her kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I was going to say that I'm falling in love with you, he whispered, but I think you figured that out. Jessica smiled, joy bubbling up despite all the uncertainty that still surrounded them. I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted. Which terrifies me almost as much as those bounty hunters. Matthew laughed softly, the sound warming her from within. We'll face it all together, starting tomorrow in Pueblo. Together, Jessica agreed, leaning into his embrace and allowing herself, just for this moment, to believe that everything might work out after all. They left before sunrise the next morning, traveling in a small wagon rather than on horseback to accommodate Matthew's injury. Billy and Joe rode ahead and behind, rifles ready, their eyes constantly scanning the rugged terrain for any sign of the bounty hunters. Jessica sat beside Matthew on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of his shoulder against hers, the confident way he handled the reins despite his wound. So much had changed between them in just one night. The acknowledgement of their feelings had created a new intimacy, but also a heightened sense of what they stood to lose if things went wrong in Pueblo. "What's your plan?" she asked as they followed the winding road that would eventually lead them to the main trail to Pueblo. "Once we get there." Matthew's expression was determined. "First, we meet with Sheriff Daniels. He's a good man. We served together briefly during the war. He'll help us. Then, depending on what he's learned, we confront either Wingate's widow or his business partner, whoever seems more likely to have been the killer. And if they deny it, if there's no proof, there's always proof if you know where to look," Matthew said confidently. "People who commit murder leave traces, Jessica. Maybe not physical evidence, but in their behavior, their stories, the gaps in their explanations." "You sound like you've done this before." A small smile touched his lips. "I tracked men across wilderness for the army. People are easier to read than wilderness. They traveled all day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and jerky that Mrs. Hoffman had packed for them. By nightfall, they had reached a small way station where travelers could find basic accommodations, little more than a stable for the horses and a simple building with rooms for rent. The proprietor, a grizzled old man named Jenkins, recognized Matthew from previous travels and greeted him warmly. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Jessica, but he asked no questions, simply showing them to the available rooms and offering a simple supper of stew and cornbread. "Only got 2 rooms left," Jenkins explained apologetically. "One for the lady, of course, and one for you and your men to share, Mr. Graham." "That'll do fine," Matthew assured him. After supper, Matthew, Jessica, Billy, and Joe gathered in the small common room to discuss their plans. The way station was otherwise empty, allowing them to speak freely. "We should reach Pueblo by midday tomorrow," Matthew said. "Billy, you and Joe will find rooms at the hotel on the edge of town, the Silver Dollar. Keep your eyes open for those bounty hunters. They might have headed back to Pueblo once they lost our trail." "What about you and Miss Ainsworth?" Billy asked. "We'll go straight to the sheriff's office. Jessica will have to stay out of sight until we've spoken with Daniels. If he's found evidence to support our theory, we'll proceed from there." Jessica nodded, though anxiety twisted in her stomach. "What if he hasn't found anything? What if they arrest me the moment I step foot in town?" Matthew reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I'll get you out again," he said simply. "But let's focus on what's likely to happen, not what might happen." Later, as they prepared to retire for the night, Matthew pulled Jessica aside in the narrow hallway outside their rooms. "Try to get some sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Jessica nodded, then impulsively rose on her toes to kiss him, a brief, sweet moment of connection. "You too, and be careful of your wound," he smiled. "Yes, madam." His expression grew serious. "Jessica, no matter what happens tomorrow, know that I meant what I said last night about my feelings for you." "I know," she whispered. "I meant it too." With one last touch of his hand against her cheek, Matthew left her at her door and continued down the hall to where Billy and Joe were waiting. Jessica watched him go, then entered her small room, her mind too full for sleep despite her exhaustion. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, rain-fitting weather, Jessica thought, for what lay ahead. They ate a quick breakfast and were on the road again as the first drops began to fall, a steady drizzle that turned the trail muddy and slowed their progress. By the time they reached the outskirts of Pueblo, it was early afternoon and the rain had intensified. Jessica's stomach clenched as she recognized the familiar buildings of the town where she'd lived for 3 years and where she'd been branded a murderess. "Pull your bonnet lower," Matthew advised as they approached the main street, "and keep your head down." Billy and Joe split off toward the Silver Dollar Hotel as planned, while Matthew guided the wagon toward the quieter side streets, eventually stopping in an alley behind the sheriff's office. "Wait here," he told Jessica. "I'll go in first, make sure Daniels is alone." She nodded, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as Matthew climbed down from the wagon and disappeared around the corner. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, jumping at every passing footstep or voice. Finally, Matthew reappeared with another man, tall and lean, with a graying mustache and the star of a sheriff pinned to his vest. "Miss Ainsworth," the sheriff said, nodding respectfully. "I'm Robert Daniels. Matt has told me quite a story about you. Let's get you inside before someone spots you." They hurried through a back door into the sheriff's office, a simple room with a desk, a few chairs, and cells visible through a doorway at the rear. Once inside, Sheriff Daniels locked the door behind them and pulled down the shades. "Now," he said, gesturing for them to sit. Let's talk about Harold Wingate's murder and why you're not responsible for it." For the next hour, Jessica recounted her story in detail: her work for Mrs. Wingate, Harold's unwanted advances, her discovery of his body, and her flight from Pueblo. Daniels listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never once giving the impression that he doubted her. When she finished, the sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Your story matches what I've been able to piece together," he said. "And it fits with what I've learned about James Hollister." "You found evidence against him?" Matthew asked eagerly. "Not physical evidence, no, but financial records that show he was embezzling substantial sums from the company he shared with Wingate, and witnesses who overheard them arguing the day before the murder. Hollister was seen leaving Wingate's office late that evening, looking agitated." "But is it enough to clear Jessica's name?" Matthew pressed. Daniels sighed. "Not yet, but I have a plan that might draw him out. If Hollister is our killer, he's been sitting pretty these past weeks, thinking he got away with murder when Miss Ainsworth took the blame and ran." He turned to Jessica. "What if he suddenly learned you were back in Pueblo and prepared to tell your side of the story?" Jessica's eyes widened. "You want to use me as bait?" "In a controlled way," Daniels clarified. "We spread the word that you've returned and are meeting with me to clear your name. If Hollister is guilty, he'll panic, might try to silence you before you can talk." "No," Matthew said firmly. "It's too dangerous." "It would be," Daniels agreed, "if we weren't prepared for him, but we will be. I'll have deputies positioned strategically. You'll be there, Matt. We'll catch him in the act." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Jessica asked. "Then we move on to Mrs. Wingate. She's my second suspect." Turns out the Wingate's finances weren't as solid as everyone thought. He had gambling debts, and there were rumors he was considering selling their home, something his wife would have strongly opposed. Matthew still looked unconvinced. "I don't like putting Jessica at risk." "Neither do I," Daniels said honestly. "But I've been a lawman for 20 years, and sometimes the only way to catch a murderer is to make them think they're about to be exposed." Jessica took a deep breath. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "If it's the only way to clear my name, I'll do it." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "When?" "Tonight," Daniels replied. "The sooner the better, before those bounty hunters realize you're in town. I'll spread the word this afternoon that Miss Ainsworth has returned and is meeting me at my office at 8 o'clock to make a full statement." "Where will she stay until then?" Matthew asked. "I have a small house on the edge of town. My deputy's wife will stay with her. You and I, Matt, need to visit Mr. Hollister and Mrs. Wingate separately, just casual calls to observe their reactions when they learn Miss Ainsworth has returned." The plan was set in motion immediately. Sheriff Daniels escorted Jessica to his home, introducing her to Mrs. Cooper, his deputy's kind-faced wife who promised to keep her safe until evening. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daniels set out to pay their strategic visits. Alone in the sheriff's modest parlor, Jessica paced anxiously, her mind racing with all that might happen that night. Mrs. Cooper tried to distract her with offers of tea and conversation, but Jessica found it hard to focus on pleasantries with her future hanging in the balance. Matthew and Daniels returned late in the afternoon, their expressions grim but determined. "Hollister nearly dropped his whiskey glass when I mentioned you were back in town," Daniels reported. "Got real quiet, then started asking too many questions about where you were staying and whether you'd spoken to anyone else." "Mrs. Wingate turned white as a sheet," Matthew added. "But she recovered quickly, said she was glad justice would finally be served." His mouth tightened. "She seemed more concerned about her social standing than anything else." "So which one is the killer?" Jessica asked. "My money's on Hollister," Daniels said. "But we'll be ready for either of them tonight." As 8 o'clock approached, Jessica found herself back at the sheriff's office, sitting in plain view near the window while deputies positioned themselves discreetly around the building. Matthew refused to leave her side, his hand never far from his gun. "It'll be over soon," he assured her quietly, "one way or another." "And if this doesn't work," she asked. "Then we try something else," he said simply. "I'm not giving up, Jessica, not on you, not ever." The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 8. Outside, the rain had stopped, but puddles still reflected the lamplight from the streets. Few people were out, a fact that Daniels said would make it easier to spot anyone approaching the office. At 5 minutes to 8, the sheriff positioned himself at his desk, pretending to take Jessica's statement. Matthew stood by the window, ostensibly as a witness but actually keeping watch on the street. "Someone's coming," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Man in a dark coat, moving fast." Daniels nodded. "Get down, Miss Ainsworth, behind the desk." Jessica had barely ducked out of sight when the door burst open. James Hollister stood in the doorway, his face contorted with desperation, a revolver clutched in his trembling hand. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice high with panic. "Where's the Ainsworth woman?" Daniels rose slowly, his hands visible. "Mr. Hollister, why don't you put that gun down and we can talk about why you're looking for Miss Ainsworth?" "Don't play games with me, Daniels," Hollister snapped. "I know she's here. I know she's going to lie about me." His eyes darted around the room, finally landing on Matthew. "Who's this?" "Another of your deputies, a friend," Matthew replied calmly. "Mr. Hollister, you're making a mistake. Why don't you shut up?" Hollister's gun wavered between them. "I'm not going to prison because of that woman's lies. Wingate was going to ruin me, going to expose me to the whole town. I had no choice." From her position behind the desk, Jessica could see Hollister's shoes, expensive leather, now muddy from the streets. She remembered those shoes from the dress shop, remembered how Hollister would come to collect Mrs. Wingate, always looking at Jessica with undisguised interest. "So you killed him," Daniels said, his voice even, "and let Miss Ainsworth take the blame." "It worked perfectly," Hollister said with a wild laugh. "Everyone was so ready to believe she'd done it. Spurned lover, they said, and she ran, made herself look guilty." "Because no one would believe her," Matthew said, his voice hard. "Because men like you and Wingate think you can do whatever you want without consequences." Hollister's laugh died. "And I still can. Once I've dealt with her, there'll be no one to say otherwise. Now where is she?" "Right here," Jessica said, rising from behind the desk to face her accuser. She was trembling but determined, meeting Hollister's shocked gaze directly. "I didn't run because I was guilty, Mr. Hollister. I ran because I knew the truth wouldn't matter to people like you." Hollister raised his gun toward her, his face twisting with rage. "You should have kept running." Everything happened at once. Matthew lunged toward Hollister as Daniels drew his own weapon. Outside, deputies burst through the door. Hollister fired a wild shot that splintered the wood of the desk. Then Matthew was on him, knocking the gun from his hand and driving him to the floor with a force born of protective fury. "It's over, Hollister," Daniels said, his gun trained steadily on the struggling man. "We have your confession, multiple witnesses. You're done." As the deputies hauled Hollister to his feet and disarmed him, Matthew turned to Jessica, his eyes scanning her for injury. "Are you all right?" She nodded, suddenly light-headed with relief. "Yes, it's over. It's really over." Matthew pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding, matching the rapid beat of her own. "I thought I might lose you," he murmured against her hair. "Never," she whispered back. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat discreetly. "Miss Ainsworth, I'd like to officially inform you that all charges against you have been dropped. Your name will be cleared publicly as soon as Hollister is processed." He smiled. You're free to go wherever you please." Jessica looked up at Matthew, seeing her future in his blue eyes. "I know exactly where I want to go," she said softly. The next morning, Jessica stood on the steps of the sheriff's office as Daniels posted a public notice clearing her name. A small crowd had gathered, including some who had been quickest to condemn her months before. She felt their stares, heard their whispers, but found that their opinions no longer mattered to her. What mattered was Matthew, standing beside her with his hand resting protectively at the small of her back. What mattered was the future they had begun to cautiously plan during the long night of celebration and relief that followed Hollister's arrest. "Ready to go home?" Matthew asked quietly as the crowd began to disperse. Home. The word resonated in Jessica's heart. Not Pueblo, not Philadelphia, but Matthew's ranch with its view of the mountains and the creek where they had almost kissed before the bounty hunters interrupted. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready." They collected Billy and Joe from the Silver Dollar Hotel, where the young cowboys had been celebrating Jessica's exoneration, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. By noon, they were on the road out of Pueblo, the wagon laden with supplies for the ranch and Jessica's few belongings rescued from storage. "What do you think those bounty hunters will do when they hear the news?" Jessica asked as the town receded behind them. Matthew smiled. "Probably curse a lot, then move on to their next target. Men like that don't dwell on failure." "I still can't quite believe it's over," she admitted. "That I'm free." Matthew's hand covered hers on the wagon seat. "Believe it, and believe this too. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The journey back to the ranch was peaceful, unmarred by bounty hunters or other threats. They traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping to camp beneath the stars rather than pushing to reach another way station. As they sat beside the campfire, Billy and Joe discreetly making themselves scarce after supper, Matthew took Jessica's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his expression serious in the firelight, "about us, about the future." Jessica's heart quickened. "What about it? I know it's fast. I know people might say we haven't known each other long enough." He met her eyes. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Jessica Ainsworth. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Jessica felt tears well in her eyes, happy tears, the first she'd shed in a long time. "Matthew Graham," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I love you too. And yes, I'll have you today, tomorrow, forever." He kissed her then, beneath the vast Colorado sky, sealing their promise to each other with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them since that first day in Central City. They returned to the ranch to a hero's welcome, Mrs. Hoffman embracing Jessica as if she were a long-lost daughter, and the ranch hands cheering when Matthew announced their intention to marry. "About time," Mrs. Hoffman declared, wiping away a suspicious moisture from her eyes. "This place has needed a woman's touch, and that man has needed someone to love for far too long." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Jessica wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair. Matthew wore his best suit, his face solemn but his eyes alight with happiness as they spoke their vows before their friends and neighbors. "I never thought I'd find this," Jessica confessed that night as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, looking out at the moonlit valley. "Love, belonging, a future." Matthew's arms encircled her from behind, drawing her back against his chest. "Neither did I," he admitted. "After everything that happened during and after the war, I thought peace was the most I could hope for." He turned her gently to face him. "But you gave me more than peace, Jessica. You gave me purpose again, joy." "Even though I brought danger to your doorstep," she teased. "Especially because of that," he replied with a smile. Reminded me that some things are worth fighting for. He brushed a gentle kiss across her lips. Some people are worth fighting for. The seasons turned, autumn giving way to winter, which eventually yielded to spring. Jessica flourished in her new life, helping to manage the ranch, establishing a small business making dresses for the women of Central City, and falling more deeply in love with her husband with each passing day. The bounty hunters never returned. Moving on to more promising targets, once word spread that Jessica Ainsworth had been officially cleared of all charges. James Hollister was sentenced to hang for the murder of Harold Wingate, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, thanks to his family's influence, a fact that bothered Jessica less than she might have expected. She had moved beyond the need for vengeance, finding healing in her new life and love. One evening, nearly a year after their first meeting, Matthew found Jessica sitting by the creek, at the spot where they had nearly been killed by the bounty hunters. The cottonwoods were in full leaf again, the water running clear and sweet over the stones. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Jessica smiled, taking his hand and placing it over her stomach. "I was thinking our child will love this spot as much as we do," she said softly. Matthew's eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Jessica felt her heart might burst with happiness. "A baby, you're sure?" She nodded, laughing as he gathered her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her carefully back on her feet as if she might break. "Careful. I'm not made of glass," she protested, though she loved his protective instincts. "When?" he asked, his hand returning to her still flat stomach with wonder. "Dr. Morris says late autumn. November, probably." She covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this a wife I adore, a child on the way, a future full of possibilities." He kissed her tenderly. "All because I happened to be in Central City the day some bounty hunters chased you down the street." "All because you were brave enough to help a stranger," Jessica corrected. "Brave enough to lead those hunters into a box canyon and take a stand." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jessica leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling their child's presence between them, a new life born of love that had emerged from danger and false accusations, a love that had proven stronger than lies or bullets or doubt. "I wouldn't change a thing," she said softly. "Not one moment of our story." Matthew's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Neither would I, Jessica, neither would I." In the years that followed, their family grew a son born that November, whom they named Daniel Robert after the sheriff who had helped clear Jessica's name, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Emma Rose. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. Sometimes, visitors to the ranch would ask how Matthew and Jessica had met, curious about the obvious depth of love between them. They would share a secret smile before telling a simplified version of their story, how she had been in trouble, how he had helped, how they had fallen in love along the way. But the full truth of bounty hunters and false accusations, of a desperate stand in a box canyon, and a confrontation with a murderer remained mostly between them, a private reminder of how their love had been forged in fire and emerged stronger for the testing. And occasionally, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Matthew and Jessica would ride together to the creek where they had first almost kissed, where they had first faced death together, and where they had first realized that what had begun as rescue had blossomed into something far more profound, a love that had saved them both in ways neither could have imagined on that dusty street in Central City so many years before.